The second segment is to answer that question, the truth. What is the truth? Because there is something that troubles me. And it's the fact that woke ideology is everywhere. We've just seen a massive shining example of it. And it's poisoning the minds of people, especially the next generation. And it has unbelievable destructive power, not just on society, but on the individual person. A lot of that was very much about the heart of the person, changing them. Now, woke means to be awake. Specifically, to be awake to the hidden systems of oppression in a society that need to be attacked and overthrown. And in particular, the following areas are typically singled out as areas of oppression. Firstly, male and female identity. There is none. Get rid of it. Secondly, there's no firm standards about how you ought to be, only how you feel. Thirdly, you should act on your feelings, passions, lusts and desires, and that is empowerment and that is your identity. Also, oppression is not just gender, sexuality, it's also race and other things like that. And by the way, the climate is changing, so global action is needed to stave off a world-ending crisis. Because the point is that society is fundamentally broken and the whole thing needs to be overthrown to save us from all of these evils. But there's another strange impact of all of this, and you will have noticed it. Namely this, it undermines people's faith. It takes young people away from God, away from Christ. It takes them away from the gospel and from what Scripture says. Everywhere I go, this is a real tragedy, but everywhere I go, I hear from parents who are vexing their souls about their children who have turned away from God. Why? Well, I can tell you for one thing, each of the doctrines of woke is a lie that is fundamentally opposed to the truth. But also the woke lifestyle, if embraced, is antithetical to the life to which God called us, because it calls people to rebellion. It calls people to indulge their sinful nature as the highest priority. That is their identity. That is what they serve. That is the highest good. And that is the timeless sin of the human race. Romans 1, to worship and serve the creature rather than the Creator. It reverses the whole situation. In fact, it was probably what was referred to in Genesis when it says to be as gods, knowing good and evil. That was the temptation. In other words, to be like God, knowing good and evil, deciding what is right and wrong. And we vested in the self for ourselves, not God. But simply, I want to make this point, it's not good enough to just attack and undermine these things and scoff at them, as much as that might be reasonable. Because most people who oppose these things in our culture at large stop at that. They spend all day scoffing at these things. Much of the conservative commentariat stops at that. They just say it's ridiculous, it's stupid, and it's wrong. But the trap is that we don't proclaim the truth that stands in its place. We find these matters ourselves so controversial that we dare not even whisper them in the four walls of some churches. So we keep quiet. And a new generation is lost for the Lord. Because they don't hear the antidote. They don't hear the truth. And some people say, oh, well, all people need is a conversion experience. Well, do you know the gospel itself starts with the gospel about God the Creator? Romans 1 teaches us that. And really, God the Creator was what was undermined in the 20th century. And a lot of people thought, well, we've still got God Redeemer, so we're okay. Well, no, if there's no God Creator, then why do you need a God Redeemer? Because God Creator is the one who defines the answers to all of these issues, like your sexuality and your race and all the rest of it. That's where it comes from, creation. And so many of these intersections, as they call them, are attacks on creation and God as Creator. But we need to proclaim the truth that stands in its place, and so I'm going to do that with the time that I have remaining tonight. But first, I want to start with a general principle that counteracts one of the general principles of woke. The things taught in the good society and the things that young people will encounter at school, among friends, and in various other ways in our modern world, they are temptations. Knowing about all of this sexualized material, understanding these things entices the sinful nature. It is hard to resist. You know, there was something really accurate about the character, the sirens in ancient Greek mythology, whose song the sailors could not resist if they were heard. You know, there's something about that in the human nature, or indeed in the garden. What was it about the fruit? Oh, it was very pleasant to the eye. Oh, it was very desirable. Now, on the other side of that fruit was a black hole of death. Oh, but it looked so good. And the sinful nature is tempted. And temptation beckons to something within us. And for a young person, they are particularly vulnerable to new and seemingly exciting information. How do you protect a person from this temptation? And you know, the best answer to that question, there's a number of answers, but the core answer to that question is given to us in the wisdom literature of the Bible. And it is the fear of the Lord. What does it say in Ecclesiastes? Fear God, keep his commandments. What does it say in Proverbs? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, of doing right, of living right, of being right in all your ways. It's fear of God. And it is my sincere conviction that the vast majority of our problems today come down to this simple issue, and it is an inadequate view of God. An inadequate view of him as one who is mighty, who is great, who is powerful, who is other, and who is supremely just. And these are softened in the modern day like they never are in Scripture. Practically every time, I speak about the wrath of God, someone will always feel the need to interject and say, yes, but the love of God. Do you know what? I've never had the opposite problem. I've never talked about the love of God and had a single person go, oh yes, but the wrath of God, it's not happened yet. The other has happened many, many times. But here's the thing. When we speak of the love of God, we also need to know that we speak of a God who will judge us all on our reaction to that love. God is an awesome God. God is a consuming fire. The writer to Hebrews says it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And you read those scriptures, as we should, where men met God. And what is their first reaction? Fear. They thought they would die. Not just in the Old Testament, but in the New also. Think of Revelation chapter 1, John falling on his face as though a dead man at the revelation of the glory of Christ. Yes, God is love. Yes, Jesus is meek and lowly, receiving sinners, saying, come unto me. Yes, there is a throne of grace and mercy, which is always open for us. But see, that is his attitude towards the penitent, the humbled, the sinners who know their need. Against willful sin, his wrath is revealed, Romans 1. Against rebellion, his mercy will not last forever. But he shows us his ways, and his ways are good. And the wise man walks in those ways. The wise man fears God in reverence for who he is, and in great reverence for his truth, and in reverence for his ways, and great reverence for his judgment. And the wise man knows that this is right. Do you know it is impossible to train someone fully in the way of wisdom if they have an inadequate view of God? Never forget what motivated Joseph. When he was away in the land of Egypt as a teenager, away from the influence of his father, his family, his surroundings, when his life was effectively over, when nobody was watching, what did he say? How can I do this great sin against my God? That was what protected Joseph. And that is the ultimate protection in your life and the life of your children in a world that is enticing them, tempting them to rebellion. Teach them about God and don't cut any corners. That is the most important start. And that will address one of the greatest doctrines of the good society and its effect. I do know, actually, I can think of times in my life, we all have days of testing. We all have experiences in our life when we think back and go, God protected me that day. Or, oh, that was a real moment that could have gone either way. So often, it was a sense of God that brought me through. Now, of course, he makes his sense felt in those moments. But if you can get that for your children and for yourself, it will protect you from many a thing. But of course, one of the other doctrines that this will address of woke is who am I? The doctrine of identity. Because kids are taught that identity is how you feel about yourself, and any standard that contradicts you is oppressive, and identity is something that comes from within you. But here's that helpful list, of course, I keep talking about. But here's the problem. Jesus actually said that what comes out of the heart of a person is what defiles the person. He said that. In fact, the whole treatment that he gives of that topic is much more confronting and serious. But see, here's the problem, and I said this a couple of times already tonight. You have a sinful nature. If you look inside yourself to find out who you are, you're going to come up with some pretty bad answers. In fact, you're going to keep on corrupting yourself and getting worse. That's why the culture of self-love and worshipping the creature is one of the most toxic things, might be the most toxic thing ever. Because when people, they're not supposed to look inside of themselves. They were only ever supposed to be defined by looking to God because we were made in His image. Genesis 1:27. It always started with God. Always. But of course we know that you've got to fill in the gap that because that image has actually been defaced in us because of our sinful natures, that's the fall. The Bible calls it the image of Adam, and it passed to all men because all sinned, Romans 5. And people say, well, I don't believe you on that. People aren't inherently sinful. People aren't inherently bad. And I say, well, all right. I don't have kids of my own, but I've seen 10 nieces and nephews. Some of them are here tonight. I've seen lots of other people's kids. Tell me this, why do you never have to teach a child to do the wrong thing? Just doesn't need doing, does it? In fact, your whole life is dedicated towards teaching a child to do right and good. And in fact, it's an uphill battle for a very, very long time, even if they are beautiful children. We all know that. But see, this is why people are so capable, so civilized, so good, and yet so messed up and hopeless and evil at the same time. They were made great, but they fell. But here is the hope. The New Testament calls Jesus the image of God. He is the perfect restoration of the holiness and the righteousness and the relationship to God that we lost in the fall and that we need to recover today. And so when you hear that phrase, image of God, I want to start a revolution here. Let's stop thinking about ourselves. Let's think about Jesus when we hear that phrase, because we're supposed to look to Him, and He's better at it than we are at being the image of God. We are called to be like Him. Don't look in yourself, young person. Look outside of yourself. Lift your eyes to Christ and know Him and be like Him. And I've got to tell you that if you're going to do that, you're going to need a Bible. And you're going to need the discipline to actually study it properly. Because it is only then, by the Word of God, that you receive, as James says, that changes you. It implants in you as a seed and brings about that change. So instead of asking, who am I think we should encourage our young people, and we ourselves should ask, who is God? And the rest is going to fall in place, because it'll lead us to Christ and it will lead us to His Word. But of course, we started with a proper understanding of God in the first place, so that naturally falls into place. We look to God and it all works out. You've broken the back of all of this woke stuff in those simple, basic elementary principles of the faith. And then that will go on to change their life and shape their answers and shape our answers to everything. We will be submitted to what God says about everything. And so when we encounter a concept like gender identity, we don't need that much, all we need to know is Genesis 1:27. God made man in His own image. In the image of God He created him, male and female He created them. That's the answer to gender identity. And here's the other side of that. One of the callings on us, I think to image God is a calling on our life. As much as it is, it's not just a statement of what we are, it's a calling on our life. But also male and female, we're realising in the modern age that also is a calling on our life. And here's one of the controversial things to say, but it's so true. We need to actually live as a man or a woman in this world as part of our calling by God in creation. And by all means. And that gives us purpose. And people will say that, these gender stereotypes, as they call them, which you find in the Bible, 2 words for the man in Genesis, worker and keeper. 2 words for the woman, helper and mother. Now, people get very upset by that. Well, there it is. And could it be actually that fulfillment and liberty and peace is found in doing what we're made for? I mean, is that a novel idea? And in that we find the biblical emphasis to which men and women are called. We find the centre of gravity of our lives and our purpose. I don't think it's actually saying you definitely can't do any of these other things. There's certain flexibility, we know that. But there is a centre of gravity given for all of us. Young people are crying out for that truth. We run this program, you'll see, I think you might have seen a video on the download, or is it coming? It's coming. It used to be called GPS, it's called the download. And we're going to have 150 people in Sydney this year in order to do that. Very exciting time. I tell you what, the talk I do called God's Gender Agenda, the most popular talk of the week by far. They are so desperate, because do you know something? If you walk up to an 18-year-old and you say, hey mate, what's a man? He cannot answer your question. What's a woman? She cannot answer your question. That's where we've come to. And we've not taught the truth about these things, we've only criticised the error. That's the change we've got to make. But also, you're going to find that our attitude to the issue of sexual orientation changes as well. There's another very simple answer to that, Genesis 2:22-24. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. And the man said, this at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. That's the answer. Now, if you start with yourself and your passions and your desires and you say that's the important thing, you'll be led into all sorts of stuff. All sorts of, in fact, it's limitless. The world today doesn't seem to have got the memo that it's limitless. That's not really the point. God says, oh, you feel passions and desires, do you? Here's the answer. Here's the answer. There's really only one. It is so simple. One man, one woman becoming one whole together for life. You know, feminism is destroying this. You know, young people, a lot of them, they feel like there's conflict between the genders. There's a subtle conflict narrative. It's never meant to be that way. Man was not himself by himself in Genesis. A woman didn't exist at all until she was created with the man. I mean, the feminist says that a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. I'm afraid it might be just a little more than that in most cases. There are obviously exceptions in the Bible, by the way, for celibacy and that, but we're not going there. We're going with principles at the moment. The emasculation of men is destroying this, and that's a big part of that program. It kept coming up. What's this obsession with high heels and lipstick and dresses? It's destroying manhood. And you know, if you make weak men, you make a bad society. That's the reality. And it's interesting to me, I'm just going to say this since I feel like the crowd's on my side, so I'm just going to say it. Do you know something? Just as they say, put this in your pipe and smoke it. Think about this. In Isaiah, I think it's chapter 3, God's judgment on the nation is that they are ruled by women and children. That's God's judgment. I find that astounding. When you look at Greta Thunberg ruling the UN, you've got to ask a question, right? What's going on here? And I do think, as I said on my Facebook the other day, there's a substantial sense in which the West is under judgment because we are getting all of these things. And God, when he judges a society, he gives them exactly what they want. And that's where we're at. It will also shape the life on the question of women's empowerment. Do you know, abortion kept popping its head up in this Good Society curriculum. And the only empowerment it talked about was financial empowerment. And that was the ultimate thing. Well, it's interesting, and it said that motherhood stereotypes were disempowering. It actually denigrated motherhood and children right throughout. You know that that is not from a good place, because right throughout the entire Bible, motherhood is held up and esteemed above most other vocations. It's quite an extraordinary theme for those who care to read and see it, and I have talked a bit about that in other segments. And here's the other thing, speaking of abortion and family and children, Genesis 1:28, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Could it be that maybe in that you might find fulfillment and empowerment, to use their word? That's why it's great there's only 5 surnames in the room. Again, doing what we were made for, right? That's the main thing. On racism, they will know that there's only one human race. What does the Apostle Paul say? Acts 17:25, God himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and boundaries of their dwelling place that they should seek God. There's one race, it's the human race, and racism will go away the day we realise that, and the day we forget about race. But the critical race theorist says the only way around it is to be radically colour conscious so that the retribution can come and the punishment can be paid. That's what critical race theory says. The opposite is true. And on climate, this is the last one. Again, I'm not against looking after the environment. I need to make that proviso. Some people don't see that. They get a bit upset. I'm not against that at all. But I am against the climate anxiety that says the world is going to end very soon because of all this human activity. Firstly, I don't think it's even true at a scientific level. But secondly, Genesis 8:21 says, "Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease." There's one reason the world hasn't ended yet. God's not done with it. And it won't end until He is. And that's our confidence that the paradigm, the overall paradigm, is under control. And it's no wonder kids are literally walking out of classrooms, and the child psychologist will tell you this, and they're going straight into the office with climate anxiety because they think the world is going to end. Well, do you know what? If I thought I had to control the climate, I'd be pretty anxious as well. Because I can't do that. And even if it could be done, I'm not going to achieve it. The world is way too complicated. You've got China for one thing, they're not going to stop. So it's just not going to work. I as myself cannot achieve this. But here's what I want to say in conclusion. Is any of this easy? Actually, in today's world, it's not easy. And for young people who have to stand apart, and actually who some of these curriculum resources marginalise based on their beliefs, it is not easy. It's difficult. We need to actually create tough young people. It is not easy to do this in today's world, but there is obviously someone who will enable them to do it and enable us to do it. It is only the Spirit of God who will, by applying the finished work of Jesus Christ to our hearts, cause Christ to grow within us and give us the power and give us the ability and give us the inclination to do all of these things. And so I want to say to those of you who have children who are yours or who you know of, who you take interest in, or, and indeed for yourselves, pray that Christ will do in their hearts what you can't. And point them always to Christ, who not only shows them the path of life for the here and now, but for all eternity. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Martin Niles, and that was The Truth of It.